I just want to talk to you through your language of anatomy notes. We do have a bit of our own language we use, but as long as we all know what the words are and what they mean, we can all be on the same page. So let's start about the difference between anatomy and physiology. Anatomy is basically the what things are, like what it is, where it is, what it's called, the structure and shape of those body parts. The physiology is how they work. How is it your muscles are able to shorten and contract? How are your nerves able to send signals? So the anatomy is basically the what it is, physiology is the how it works. Within anatomy, we break it into 4 basic topics. Gross anatomy is not things that are yucky and disgusting. It's things that are big enough that you can see with a naked eye. So your heart, your lungs, your kidney, bones, those you can see. So that's what gross anatomy is. Regional anatomy, this is going to be stuff in a certain region. So you can look at your arm and study all the muscles, the bones, the nerves, the blood vessels in your arm. A podiatrist is someone who is an expert in studying the foot. Systemic is kind of what we do, is we do system by system. So we'll study the skeletal system, the muscular system, the integumentary system, so on and so forth. And within that, we also do microscopic. We're going to look at what is it that's super, super small, because those cells and tissues are actually what determines how the system works. This you've seen before. It's that basic structure, like all things are made of atoms, and those atoms are put together to make molecules. So like your hydrogen and oxygen come together to make water. And you have little molecules like water, but you also have big molecules that we'll talk about, like your proteins and lipids and things like that. And those come together to make your cell. And this is the level of difference between living and non-living. Living things are made of cells. Non-living things like your desk, your car, is made of atoms and molecules. Living are cells, and different cell types make tissues. And you've studied this before, but you've never talked about the different tissues. And you have connective tissue, you have muscle tissue, you have nervous tissue, and those different tissues work together to make organs. And those organs come together to make your systems, and then that makes up you. An important thing about anatomy is structure and function. The way things are built determine what they do. Okay? The way they are built determine what they do, and vice versa. So, just like the library is built very different than the jail at the police station. The library is big, open area, lots of books everywhere. The police station jail cells have individual little jails, right? Because their function is to hold people, versus the library is so you can look around and get books. Same thing in your body. All those different cells, your bone cells, are going to be structured very differently than your nerve cells because they have a different function. Anatomical position, this is an important thing to be aware of. These are the 4 main components of anatomical position. The reason we use this is we have a standard of comparison, so that we always assume that you are in anatomical position, meaning that the body is straight, that you're facing the front, arms are at your side, and palms are forward. This palms forward gets real important, and I'll tell you here in a little bit. But this way, whether it's an autopsy or a medical examination or whatever, we always assume it's facing an anatomical position. All right, let's talk directional terms a moment. This is basically, instead of, if you're giving someone directions to drive to Kohl's, if you're coming from Flower Mound, it's on the right side of the road. But if you're coming from Louisville, Kohl's is on the left side of the road. However, if I say it's on the south side of the road, I'm correct either which direction you're driving. So that's the same kind of thing with directional terms and why we use them. And so I'll show you what all of those are. So starting with superior and inferior, superior is towards the head. So basically it means above, right? My forehead is superior to my nose because my forehead is above my nose, but we say superior. And the opposite of that is inferior. So it's away from the head. So just like my navel or belly button is inferior to my breastbone, means it's below my breastbone. So it's basically above is superior, below is inferior. Anterior is also known as ventral. This is the front of the body and towards the front. So your kneecap is on the anterior side of the body. My heart is anterior to my spinal cord because it's in front. The reverse of that is posterior or dorsal. And this you might know because you sit on your posterior, or like sharks and whales, this here fin on the back is known as the dorsal fin because it's on its back. So dorsal is towards the back. So my heart is anterior to my spine because it's in front of it, but it's posterior to the breastbone because it's behind it. So this is basically in front means anterior and behind is posterior. Medial and lateral. Medial means towards the midline. Lateral means away from the midline. And it does not have to be on the midline. It just means towards the midline. So like in this picture, if you're looking at your knee, here's my big toe. So this is the inside of my leg. So this is medial because it's towards where that midline would be, and lateral is away from it. And especially in your knee, if you've heard of your MCL, your medial collateral ligament, your LCL, your lateral collateral ligament, and on the inside you have your ACL, which is your anterior cruciate ligament, and your PCL, which is your posterior cruciate, like we just talked about on the last slide. So medial and lateral. Medial is towards the midline. Lateral is away from the midline. Proximal and distal. This is what you use if you're on your arms and legs. Always. So proximal means closer into your trunk. So, and this is your trunk. Your torso is known as your trunk. So proximal means closer in, like proximity, and distal means further away, like distant. So my elbow is proximal to my wrist because my elbow is closer in to my wrist. My knee is distal to my thigh because the knee is further away than my thigh. So this is really important. Arms and legs, we always use proximal and distal. And the reason for that is if you incorrectly used superior, that this is above, what happens if I lift my hand over my head? Well, now my elbow is no longer superior to my wrist. It could be below my wrist. But if you use proximal and distal, my elbow is always closer in to the trunk. So proximal and distal, closer in, further away. And then the last two are superficial and deep. Superficial is towards the surface. Just like a paper cut. Deep is more internal, like if you got a knife wound. And so in this picture you can see these are superficial muscles because they're here on top, and deep is like your scapula and these other muscles that are underneath these superficial muscles. Body plane, this is how we can cut the body into different planes. So the first is your sagittal plane. You can see this cuts you into right and left. As long as you think like right and left, that helps you figure out sagittal. If it's in the middle, we call it mid-sagittal, and if it's to the side a little, we call it parasagittal. For the most part, as long as you know sagittal, you're good to go. Frontal or coronal, this basically cuts you into front and back. So as long as you know front and back, you can figure out this one. So as you can see in this diagram. And then the last is your transverse plane. This basically cuts you into top and bottom halves of the body. And so if I look at this picture, I can look at my brain here and know that this is a transverse cut because I've got top and bottom parts of my brain. Versus this one, I can look at it and I have left and right sides of the brain, so therefore that's a sagittal cut. And then this bottom one, I can see that I have front and back parts of the brain. So since I have front and back, that's a frontal or coronal plane. The last little bit are your body cavities. Your body's kind of divided into little cubbies. Remember in like kindergarten where you had a cubby where you stuck your stuff? Your body has that too. We have dorsal cavities, which are here on the back, because remember, dorsal is towards the back. And there's two of them, a cranial, which holds your brain, and your vertebral, which holds your spinal cord. So cranial cavity, vertebral cavity together make up my dorsal cavities because they are here on the back. And then you have ventral cavities, which are on the front, because remember, ventral is front. Above the diaphragm is your thoracic cavity, and that's where your heart and lungs and esophagus and stuff are. And then below the diaphragm is called the abdominopelvic cavity. Abdominopelvic, because it's made of the abdominal and pelvic cavity. Abdominal cavity is all of this stuff up here where your stomach and liver and intestines and all that is. Your pelvic cavity, this is down here. You can see the outline of the pelvic bone. So this area inside my pelvic bone would be my pelvic cavity. So primarily this is where you have your urinary and genital organs. And that is it. So if you have any questions, please let me know.